All right, we are on. Oop, yelling into the microphone, I think. We are on chapter 6. If you have stuck with me so far during this, thank you for doing that. Leave a like or whatever to, if you've done that. Um, you probably have noticed that I've done it in different kinds of formats. Sometimes I've had some notes in front of me. Sometimes I've written out a whole entire script. Sometimes I've tried to kind of do it off the top of my head while going and reading some things. The reason I'm doing that is if I'm going to do this sort of thing in the future on the channel, I want to know which ways sort of resonate. Sometimes when I'm just reading, like right now I'm not reading anything, and I think it's more clear because I know when I'm reading, I can really tell, and I sound very wooden. Now, I do like writing out my, I do like writing out things logically to make sure I get the right point out. But at the same time, it does sound wooden. So I am just trying to work with some of those things, and see what I want to do in the future with this sort of thing. But we are on chapter 6. It shouldn't be a very big one. And then we have chapter 7 and chapter 8. And then I think when we're at the very end of this, I think I'm going to do some kind of quick sort of overview where I will be more careful. I'll probably make some slides and things about some central misconceptions that I think we have when we talk about the threat of communism. Because I think, like you, or like a lot of people, I knew about a lot of this stuff, or but there are some things that I am kind of a newbie on as well, especially with a lot of these names and particulars. And I'm Canadian, so it's not as if this is necessarily my national kind of history. This is a very American story, even though we're talking about deep state and things that go international. Uh, it's enlightening though, and I think it's very important. So I'm glad that you guys have made it with me. So at the start of this chapter called "The Rockefellers and the Reds," he says this: the most important American of those different personages who run the world from behind the scenes are the Rockefellers. They have worked with the Rothschilds and their agents since the 1880s. However, at an early time here, opinion ran so high against the Bolsheviks because of their barbarism that it was official U.S. government policy not to deal with that outlaw government. And obviously, I skipped some stuff, but the U.S. did not officially recognize the Bolsheviks until 1933. There were these sanctions on Russia, to the point where the the Soviet economy was virtually in shambles. Communism would have collapsed. At least this version of communism in the Soviet homeland would have collapsed had it not been aided by the so-called insiders. The Bolsheviks were originally saved from collapse by Herbert Hoover, who it's noted that he was a part of this CFR, who raised money to buy food, which was appropriated by Lenin and his gangsters. They used it as a tool to subdue starving peasants, which we've seen that over and over, who had been resisting their newly imposed slave masters. While Hoover's humanitarian gesture saved the Soviet regime, the Russian economy was still in total chaos. So in come the Vanderlips, the Harrimans, and the Rockefellers. We have Frank Vanderlip, who is the president of the Rockefeller First National City Bank. It always comes back to these central banks. The Rockefellers assigned their public relations agent, Ivy Lee, to sell the American public the idea that the Bolsheviks were merely misunderstood idealists who were actually kind benefactors of mankind. So this is where the media plays into things so that these sanctions can be changed. Like, there were sanctions for good reason and the people were very much against it, but if they could change the overall perception, then they could kind of open up the doors to not only benefit the communist regime that was over there, but to benefit their own pockets ultimately. So a part of this media change was to say that the communist problem in Russia was merely psychological. By this time, talk about Russians, it was changing that, they're all right. The media would suggest that the United States should not engage in propaganda anymore, but make a plea for peaceful coexistence. It always seems to be that. And suggests that the United States would find it sound policy to recognize the USSR and advance credits. So in 1927, I believe it was, 1927, Standard Oil of New York built a refinery in Russia, thereby helping the Bolsheviks put the economy back on its feet. And this was the first major investment in Russia since the revolution. We have the Vacuum Oil Company, which concluded a deal to the Soviet oil, or to market Soviet oil in European countries. So now that's getting that back on its feet by having them not only create these refineries, but have them sell to European markets. And this was from a loan of $75 million to the Bolsheviks that was ultimately arranged. The Rockefeller Chase National Bank was also involved in selling Bolshevik bonds in the United States in 1928, but it was there. There was pushback by patriotic organizations which denounced that this was happening, called Chase Bank or Chase National Bank an international fence, and they were sort of disgraced in America that they would go and do all this just for a buck. Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking Committee, maintained in a speech to his fellow congressmen, quote, "The Soviet government has been given United States Treasury funds by the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks acting through the Chase Bank and the Guarantee Trust Company and other banks in New York City." And obviously, he would have pushed against that, and some of American public might have known that, but largely it's about kind of dispelling, concealing that through this whole smoky room sort of thing, where the best way to keep some of this stuff going is first to not let the American public know about it at all, but if they do know, to let me go back here to kind of dispel worries about it, that this is, we were wrong about the Bolsheviks and they're peaceful and we shouldn't engage in propaganda against them. It's fine. We should do this. It'll benefit us as well, and that sort of thing. And some people were pushing against this for obvious reasons. So Professor Sutton proves conclusively in his 3-volume history of Soviet technological development that the Soviet Union was almost literally manufactured by the USA. So they would set up these plants. I think did I highlight any of those? I might have. Anyway, they set up these plants, and even though they wouldn't be like selling guns and tanks and that sort of thing, they would be setting up these plants that would manufacture, they would take these raw materials that could be used to eventually create these things that would actually serve to threaten the strength or the what am I saying? Threaten the safety of America. It almost seems like, what if Joe Biden gave billions of dollars to Iran? Wouldn't seem right. And so that sort of thing was happening. Let me find. Just want to make sure I'm not skipping anything here. Sutton quotes a report by Avril Harriman, Harriman, to the State Department in June 1944 as stating, quote, Stalin paid tribute to the assistance rendered by the United States to Soviet industry before and during the war. He said that about 2/3 of all the large industrial enterprise in the Soviet Union had been built with United States help or technical assistance. And obviously, like a communist couldn't go into America and just, go and grab a patent and everything. But through some of these relationships that they would have, that would kind of be almost like a loophole for that barrier on their part. Remember that this was at a time when the Soviets had already established an extensive spy network in the United States, and the Communist Daily Worker newspaper regularly called for the destruction of liberty in the United States and the Sovietization or the socialization of America. That was their prime goal. So for 50 years, the Federal Reserve, the CFR, Rockefeller, the insider crowd had advocated and carried out policies aimed at increasing the power of their satellite state that they kind of had as their own little puppet, the Soviet Union. So meanwhile, America spends $75 billion a year on defense, and this at that time, but spending $75 billion a year on defense to protect itself from the enemy that the insiders themselves are building up. Right? It's almost as if you have a family, on a very simplistic level, pretend you're enemies with a family across the street, and you're both declared enemies, but someone in your house is funding the other side to allow weapons to happen over there and whatnot, and you are, you're funding, you're spending all this money on defense when you could just stop funding that, right? Like that wouldn't even be an issue, and that's trickling down to, that's just trickling down to the public and everyone else. So the United States put into effect today one of President Johnson's proposals for stimulating East-West trade by removing restrictions on the export of more than 400 commodities to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And these are those non-strategic, close quote, quote, close quote, non-strategic items such as, textiles, rubber, crude and hides, fodder, cereals, vegetables, metal ore, scrap, petroleum, gas, chemical compounds and products, dyes, medicines, fireworks, detergents, things like that, which on their own, they're just, they're no threat on their own, but they are essential if you are creating this war machine against another nation. So meanwhile, nearly at this very same time when this was written, nearly 50,000 Americans had died in Vietnam. And the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese received 85% of their war materials from who? From Russia and the Soviet bloc nations. So if you follow the bread trail, it's almost as if America itself was funding the other side of the Vietnam War. And it's not even that it was necessarily them, but it was these other bankers who, if there weren't these other formal declarations of war and things like that, they could have been, it sure sounds like treason, but because of these silly loopholes and whatnot, and it's just been this way, it's terrible what has happened. Since their economies, let's see. Since their economies are incapable. Where am I? I just expanded my screen to my notes and I totally lost what I was finding. Oh, here we go. So the 50,000 Americans died in Vietnam, received war materials and funding 85% from Russia and Soviet bloc nations. Since their economies are incapable of supporting a war, the communist arm of the conspiracy needed the help of from the finance capitalist arm. They have the communist arm of the conspiracy, and then you have the capitalist arm of the conspiracy. The United States had been financing and equipping both sides of the terrible Vietnamese War, killing our own soldiers by proxy. The landscape painters in the mass media have kept the American public from learning this provable fact. The author goes on here. Not surprisingly, the Rockefellers have been leaders in championing this bloody trade. On January 16th, 1967, one of the most incredible articles ever to appear in a newspaper graced the front page of the establishment's daily, the New York Times. Under the headline, Eaton joins Rockefellers to spur trade with Reds, the article stated, quote, an alliance of family fortunes leaking Wall Street and the Midwest is going to try to build economic bridges between the free world and communist Europe. The International Basic Economy Corporation, controlled by the Rockefeller brothers, and Tower International Inc., headed by Cyrus S. Eaton Jr., Cleveland financier, plan to cooperate in promoting trade between the Iron Curtain countries, including the Soviet Union. So here we have this more plants being built. We have the world's largest truck factory, which, as you know from World War II, that can be quickly retrofitted into building tanks and other things. We have other things like a $50 million aluminum producing plant for the Reds, which aluminum for jet planes is considered one of these non-strategic things under the Johnson-Nixon doctrine. It's wild. How much more in this? Okay, some really interesting stuff coming up. So we have the Rockefeller and the Eaton families have now joined forces to build war production plants between the Iron Curtain, which even if they're not war production plants, like he's calling it that because it can be so easily retrofitted into such. So building these plants behind the Iron Curtain so that the communists can become a bigger threat to U.S. survival. And if one country feels like they have a threat, then they are more likely to borrow, and that just means more money, right? More power, more monopolies, more rights being given up. America spends $70 billion a year ostensibly I can never say that stupid word, ostensibly on defense, and then the Rockefellers build aluminum mills for the communists. Only the absence of a formal declaration of war in Vietnam keeps the Eatons and the Rockefellers from being actionable for treason. They have the blood of nearly 50,000 American servicemen on their hands. I want to read this next part without skipping anything, just because the way he put it, I wouldn't be able to summarize it better. So here we go. Quote, does it make sense to spend $75 billion a year on national defense and then deliberately increase the war-making potential of an avowed enemy? It does to Mr. Rockefeller and the insiders. Sorry, I was just interrupted, and I think that's where I finished off. I'm still quoting here, since the Rockefellers have contacted to arrange for patents for the Soviets, they are by dictionary definition communist agents. Would it not be more accurate to define the communists as Rockefeller agents? Indicative of this war, a strange event has occurred, which occurred in October in 1964. David Rockefeller, president of Chase Manhattan Bank and chairman of the board of the Council of Foreign Relations, took a vacation in the Soviet Union. This is a peculiar place for the world's greatest imperialist to take his vacation, since much of communist propaganda deals with taking all of David's wealth away from him and distributing it to, quote, the people. A few days after Rockefeller ended his vacation in the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev was recalled from a vacation of his own at a Black Sea resort to learn that he had been fired. How strange. As far as the world knew, Khrushchev was the absolute dictator of the Soviet government, and more importantly, head of the Communist Party, which runs the USSR. Who has the power to fire the man who is supposedly the absolute dictator? Did David Rockefeller's journey to the Soviet Union, was that just to fire an employee? Obviously, the position of premier in the Soviet Union is a figurehead, with the true power residing elsewhere, perhaps in New York. For 5 decades, the communists have based their propaganda on the theme that they were going to destroy the Rockefellers and the other super rich. Yet we find that the 5 decades of the Rockefellers, or for 5 decades that the Rockefellers have been involved in building the strength of the Soviets. Does that make sense? It's the same thing with the neighbors on the other side swearing to destroy one of the people that's actually funding them. So while, is it that the Rockefellers are just foolish, or is it something else? Is it that it's all just a smokescreen? So while David runs the financial end of the Rockefeller dynasty, Nelson Rockefeller runs the political, and Nelson wanted to be president of the United States. President Nixon and Nelson Rockefeller competed for the Republican nomination in 1968. Obviously, he would have rather won the prize himself, but regardless of who won, he would ultimately control the highest office in the land because he would use President Nixon as his own puppet, so to speak. So in The Making of the President, 1960, Theodore White noted that Nixon accepted the Rockefellers' terms for this meeting that they had. President Nixon was going to, he wanted to phone Nelson Rockefeller, and no one quite knew exactly what it was about. And, it's weird that they would have this meeting when they were almost like these enemies. The meeting produced the infamous Compact of Fifth Avenue, in which the Republican platform was ultimately scrapped and replaced by Rockefeller's socialist plans. So I guess I guess I misspoke when we said we didn't know what came from that. Maybe I'm thinking of a different phone call. They comprise the things in this plan. There are 14 points that are very liberal. They comprise of a platform that's akin in many ways to the Democratic platform of the day. The whole story behind what happened in Rockefeller's apartment when they had this meeting will doubtless, the whole story will doubtless never be known. We can only make an educated guess in light of subsequent events, but it is obvious that since that time, Mr. Nixon has been in Rockefeller's orbit. After losing to Kennedy by just a little bit, the author here says that the Rockefellers wanted him to enter the California gubernatorial race. He did that. He lost to Pat Brown in 1962. He was basically consigned to the political garbage bin. He left his practice as an attorney in California. He went to New York. And of all places, he moved in as a neighbor to Nelson Rockefeller, who was, kind of his arch enemy. He was in this $100,000 a year apartment, which at that time especially is like crazy, in a building owned by Rockefeller, and he didn't. It's not like President Nixon was a rich man at this time, and yet he goes to this building owned by the Rockefellers. Then Mr. Nixon went to work for a law firm, for the law firm of Mr. Rockefeller's personal attorney, John Mitchell, who is very influential in this story. And in the next 6 years, spent most of his time touring the country of the world, first rebuilding his political reputation, and then campaigning to get the 1968 Republican nomination. This was like a major rise, kind of like this Phoenix Rising moment. At the same time, according to his own financial statement, his net worth multiplied many times, and he became quite wealthy. Nelson Rockefeller and his colleagues of the Eastern liberal establishment, who helped make Nixon acceptable to conservatives by appearing to oppose him, rescued Nixon from political oblivion and made him president of the United States. Does it not make sense that Mr. Nixon, the man of passionate ambition, whose career had sunk to the bottom, had to make some deals in order to reach his goal? It seems like he had just acquired some massive political debt. So when Nixon when he left Washington, he, by his own claim, had little more than an Oldsmobile automobile. He had his respectable Republican cloth coat and a government pension, and yet he was able to expand this. And it may be that the frugal Richard Nixon acquired this through some shrewd investments and just penny pinching, that sort of thing. But then again, it may have been that Nixon's deal with Rockefeller and whatever that was, and the insiders, that deal kind of elevated him and got rid of his personal poverty problems. And like strange, for sure wouldn't have been able to afford this $100,000 a year place, seems like, but whatever. He was elected president on a platform which promised to stop America's retreat before world communism. Yet he appointed Henry Kissinger, a man who represented the opposite of the stance Mr. Nixon took during his campaign, to a position which is virtually assistant president. Is it surprising then that President Nixon has done just the opposite of what he promised he would do during his 1968 campaign? How exactly did President Nixon come to pick an ultra-liberal to be his number one foreign policy advisor? We are told by Time magazine that President Nixon met Kissinger at a cocktail party. He was just like super impressed by his repartee and whatnot, but that would have been ridiculous to appoint him to this powerful position just based on that. And again, just like the Rockefellers, like Nixon wasn't stupid, and it must have been, according to the author, that Kissinger was appointed by arrangement from Nelson Rockefeller. We have all these circles and people in orbit of other people, and it seems like President Nixon was certainly in the orbit of Nelson Rockefeller, who was in the orbit of others, and we have the Soviets in the same orbits. We keep fighting about the things that are in orbit without looking at the things that are at the center. But it's hard because there's all these different circles, and again, we have these smoky rooms. President Nixon's fantastic about face or turnaround was praised by Lyndon Baines Johnson in the Washington Star of December 1st, 1971. The paper states, and this is interesting, quote, "Former President Lyndon B. Johnson acknowledges it is Baines, right? I saw B and it is Baines, right? Lyndon B. Johnson acknowledges that Richard Nixon, as a Republican president, has been able to accomplish some things that a Democratic president could not have. Could you just see the uproar? He asked during a recent interview. If I had been responsible for Taiwan getting kicked out of the United Nations, or if I had imposed sweeping national controls on prices and wages, Nixon has gotten by with it, he observed, an appreciative tone in his voice. If I had tried to do it, or Truman, or Humphrey, or any Democrat, we would have been clobbered. Not interesting. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Republican or Democrat, both ways, you can kind of get things done. And maybe when you don't vote for the socialist, the overt socialist voice, maybe you can sometimes even get further things passed just because, people will trust the non-socialist, right? Crazy stuff. Nelson, Rockefeller, and Richard Nixon are theoretically political enemies, but Rocky arranged the 1968 election so that if he could not be president, someone whom he controlled could be. Among those who hail President Nixon's move to the left is Alger Hiss, the communist spy Richard Nixon helped convict. It was the Hiss case which catapulted Nixon from obscurity into the Senate, the vice presidency, and eventually the White House. So, hopefully this wasn't too long, like 30 minutes. We are going into the last two chapters. The next one is called Pressure from Above and Pressure from Below. Talk to you on the next one. Bye.